In a crowded courtroom, a powerful CEO loses control and assaults his pregnant wife in front of the judge. What seemed like just another hearing turns into a historic trial when the judge, the victim's mother, decides to act. What follows is the fall of an empire built on abuse and the rebirth of a woman determined to reclaim her freedom. If this story has interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching us from. Let's continue. I promise you this is going to be the best story you will ever listen to. The courtroom was imposing, with a high ceiling decorated with plaster moldings reminiscent of the classical architecture of London's public buildings. The wide windows let in the morning light, which sliced through the room in golden beams, illuminating dust particles suspended in the air. The silence was almost palpable, broken only by the occasional sound of a pen dropping, or someone rustling papers on the table. Television cameras were strategically positioned at the back, with journalists seated in organized rows, notebooks open, ready to capture every word, every gesture, every facial expression that could make a headline. This was no ordinary divorce. Media commotion had begun weeks earlier when the first rumors about the case leaked. Roderick Thompson, CEO of Thompson Developments, one of the country's largest construction companies, was facing a divorce proceeding that promised to expose much more than just the dissolution of a marriage. Reporters whispered among themselves, speculating about what might surface during the hearing. Some spoke of phantom accounts, others of financial manipulation, and there were even those who mentioned abusive behavior within the relationship. At the plaintiff's table, Roderick was impeccable. His navy blue suit was perfectly tailored, his Italian silk tie precisely aligned, and his shoes gleamed as if fresh out of the box. He leaned slightly to the left, where his lawyer, a middle-aged man with graying hair and thin-rimmed glasses, whispered something in his ear. Roderick barely seemed to pay attention. His eyes were fixed on the woman seated across the room, an expression of poorly disguised contempt on his face. Marina Thompson sat beside her lawyer, a determined woman named Clara Miller, known for her incisive work in domestic violence cases. Marina wore a discreet beige dress, her dark hair pulled back in a low bun. Her right hand rested on her belly, which was already beginning to show signs of pregnancy. On her left arm, a purplish bruise was still visible, despite the makeup she had applied in an attempt to conceal it. Her eyes, though tired, held a silent determination. She looked straight ahead, avoiding Roderick's gaze. She knew that any sign of weakness could be used against her. The side door opened and everyone present automatically stood up. Judge Helen Anderson entered with firm steps, her black robe contrasting with her gray hair styled in an elegant bun. She carried the demeanor of someone who had presided over countless trials throughout decades of her career, and her reputation for impartiality and rigor was well known throughout the judicial system of London. What no one in the room knew, except Marina and Helen herself, was that they shared a deep connection. Helen was Marina's mother. This secret had been carefully guarded to avoid any questioning of the trial's impartiality. But now, given the situation, that connection would become impossible to hide. Helen sat down, adjusted her glasses, and gently tapped her gavel on the table. The sound echoed through the room, signaling the start of the hearing. She glanced briefly at Marina, a flicker of concern passing through her eyes before she resumed her neutral, professional expression. Roderick's lawyer, Dr. Paul Carter, was the first to speak. He rose slowly, arranging the papers on the table before beginning. His voice was controlled, almost monotonous as he presented the defense's opening arguments. He spoke about the construction of Roderick's business empire, about the sacrifices made over the years, about the dedication to work which, he claimed, had been misinterpreted as family neglect. He painted Roderick as a man driven by the ambition to build something great, someone who had always provided comfort and security for his family. Marina pressed her lips together. She knew that narrative all too well. It was the same story Roderick told friends, business partners, and even herself in the early years of their marriage. But over time, Marina had learned that behind that facade of a dedicated and hard-working man, there was someone obsessed with control, incapable of accepting any form of questioning. When it was Marina's lawyer's turn, Clara Miller rose with a different energy. Her voice was firm, almost cutting, as she began to expose the facts that led to the divorce petition. She mentioned suspicious transfers of funds from the couple's joint account to Roderick's personal accounts, movements Marina only discovered by chance when trying to pay a household bill and realizing the balance was zero. Clara also brought to light the medical reports documenting the injuries Marina had suffered over the past few months, injuries she had always tried to hide, but which were now recorded in medical charts and photographs. Roderick shifted his posture. His jaw clenched, and he began to tap his fingers on the table, a sign of impatience Marina knew well. A shiver ran down her spine. She recognized that behavior. It was the prelude to an explosion. Judge Helen raised her hand, interrupting Clara. She requested that the mentioned financial documents be presented. Clara handed over a voluminous folder, which was passed to the judge. Helen began to leaf through the papers, her expression growing increasingly serious as she examined the bank statements, transfer authorizations, and transaction records totaling millions of pounds. Roderick could not contain himself. He stood up abruptly, ignoring his lawyer's gesture to remain seated. His voice echoed through the room, charged with indignation. He stated that those documents were merely part of his business administration, that Marina lacked the capacity to understand the financial complexities of a company the size of Thompson Developments. He called her naive, emotional, someone who lived in a fantasy world while he worked to sustain the luxury she enjoyed. The murmur that swept through the room was immediate. The cameras turned to Roderick, capturing every second of that outburst. Marina closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. She had promised herself she wouldn't cry that day. Not there. Not in front of so many people. Not in front of him. Helen struck the gavel forcefully, the sound reverberating off the walls. Her voice was calm yet laden with authority. She ordered Roderick to sit down and compose himself, reminding him that he was in a courtroom and must respect the judicial process. Roderick hesitated for a moment, his face red with rage, but eventually sat down, casting a defiant look at the judge. Clara continued her presentation, now bringing to light the testimonies of household staff who had witnessed heated arguments, broken objects, and, on one occasion, Marina being forced out of the house in the middle of the night after a fight. She also mentioned the text messages Roderick sent to Marina, messages laden with veiled threats, saying that she would never achieve anything without him, that he had enough power to ruin her if she tried to leave him. Roderick fidgeted in his chair, his gaze now fixed on Marina. She could feel the weight of that stare, the contained fury he was trying to disguise. She knew he had never imagined she would have the courage to expose all of that publicly. For years, Marina had been the silent wife, the woman who smiled at business parties, who accepted his excuses, who pretended everything was fine. But the pregnancy had changed something within her. The idea of bringing a child into that toxic environment, of raising a child under the shadow of that man, had been the final push she needed to act. Judge Helen requested that Marina be called to testify. Marina slowly rose, walking to the stand with measured steps. She swore to tell the truth, and then sat down, her hands clasped in her lap. Clara began to ask questions, guiding Marina through the chronology of events that had led to the divorce petition. Marina spoke about the night of August 14th, a date that would be etched in her memory forever. She had stumbled upon the bank statements by chance while looking for a payment receipt. What she saw left her shocked. Millions of pounds had been transferred from the joint account to accounts she was unaware of. When she confronted Roderick, he initially tried to downplay the situation, saying they were necessary investments for the company. But when Marina insisted, demanding detailed explanations, he exploded. She described how he raised his voice, how he threw papers on the floor, how he grabbed her arm with such force that it left those marks that were still visible weeks later. The room was in absolute silence. Even the journalists had stopped writing, completely absorbed in Marina's account. She continued, describing how she had tried to leave the room, but Roderick prevented her, blocking the door. How he said terrible things, accusing her of being a gold digger, of never having contributed anything, of being a burden he carried. Roderick could no longer contain himself. He stood up again, his voice thundering through the room. He shouted that Marina was lying, that she was distorting the facts to gain the court's sympathy. His voice was laced with venom, each word spat out with contempt. He said she had always been dramatic, that she exaggerated everything, that those marks on her arm were from a simple gesture, nothing more. He called her manipulative, someone who was trying to destroy his reputation purely out of revenge. Judge Helen struck the gavel repeatedly, her voice rising above the tumult. She ordered Roderick to sit down immediately, warning him that he was in contempt of court. But Roderick was out of control. Years of absolute power, of never being contradicted, of having people agree with everything he said, had created a man incapable of accepting opposition. And now seeing his wife exposing his flaws before cameras, before journalists, before the world, was more than he could bear. Roderick's lawyer tried to hold him by the arm, whispering frantically for him to calm down, but Roderick pushed him away. He began to walk towards Marina, his heavy footsteps echoing in the tense silence of the room. Marina instinctively stood up, backing away a few steps, her eyes wide with fear. Clara Miller positioned herself between them, raising her hand in a protective gesture. The court security guards began to move, but everything happened so fast. Roderick reached Marina. For a second he paused, looking directly into her eyes. There was something savage in that gaze, something Marina had never seen with such intensity before. And then, without any warning, he raised his hand and slapped her hard. The sound echoed through the room like a gunshot, cutting the air and freezing everyone in place. Marina staggered to the side, her hand automatically rising to protect her face. The pain was intense, throbbing, and she tasted the metallic tang of blood in her mouth. For a moment, the world around her seemed to slow down. She could hear screams in the background, her vision blurred by the pain and the tears that began to form. Clara shouted something Marina couldn't fully understand, and the security guards finally reacted, rushing towards Roderick. But Roderick didn't seem to notice. He continued screaming, saying Marina deserved that she was ruining everything he had built, that she had no right to try and destroy him. His words were incoherent, a mixture of accusations and justifications that made no sense. The security guards grabbed him by the arms, trying to immobilize him, but he resisted, struggling as he continued to shout. Marina leaned on the table, her breathing heavy. The red mark on her face began to darken, and she could feel the swelling forming. Clara was by her side, holding her shoulders, asking if she was okay, but Marina couldn't respond. Her eyes turned to Judge Helen, and for a moment, their gazes met. Marina saw the contained fury in her mother's eyes, a fury Helen was clearly struggling to control. Helen slowly rose, her posture rigid, the gavel still in her hand. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was icy, each word pronounced with cutting precision. She declared that Roderick Thompson was being arrested for contempt of court and for physical assault committed in front of a judicial authority. She ordered the security guards to handcuff him immediately and remove him from the room. The security guards obeyed, forcing Roderick to turn his back as they placed handcuffs on his wrists. He continued to struggle, shouting that it was absurd, that he had rights, that he couldn't be treated that way. But his words grew weaker and weaker, muffled by the sound of the handcuffs clicking shut and the firm footsteps of the guards dragging him out of the room. It was only when the doors closed behind him that Helen allowed her mask of impartiality to fall for a brief moment. She looked at Marina, and her next words reverberated through the room with a weight no one expected. She said in a firm voice yet laden with emotion that Roderick had assaulted her daughter in her courtroom. The silence that followed was absolute. The journalists exchanged glances, shocked. The cameras continued to record, capturing that historic moment. The revelation that the judge and the victim were mother and daughter changed everything. Some murmurs began to arise, questions being whispered, but Helen struck the gavel again, restoring order. She declared a brief recess, allowing Marina to receive medical attention and for the room to calm down. But before withdrawing, Helen made a point of clarifying that, although she was Marina's mother, every decision made in that courtroom had been based on facts and law. The family connection did not alter the gravity of the acts committed by Roderick Thompson. In the courthouse corridors, chaos erupted. Journalists rushed to transmit the news, phones rang incessantly, and social media was already exploding with speculation and opinions. The video of the assault, captured by the courtroom cameras, began circulating almost immediately, and public outrage was instantaneous. Marina was taken to a private room, where a medical team examined her. Her face was swollen and there would be a considerable bruise in the coming hours. Clara remained by her side, holding her hand, offering words of support. Marina was in shock, still processing what had happened. Part of her couldn't believe that Roderick had actually done that, right there, in front of so many people. But another part, the part that knew the real Roderick, knew it was only a matter of time until he completely lost control. Helen entered the room shortly after, closing the door behind her. For a moment, she just looked at Marina and then walked to her, embracing her tightly. Marina collapsed into her mother's arms, finally allowing the tears she had held back for so long to flow freely. Helen caressed her hair, whispering words of comfort, promising that everything would be all right, that she was safe now. But even in that moment of vulnerability, Helen knew the battle was far from over. Roderick Thompson was a powerful man with connections throughout the city. He would not accept his downfall without a fight, and now, with the public revelation that the judge was Marina's mother, there would be those who would question the legitimacy of the judgment, who would call for the annulment of the proceedings, who would try to use that connection to reverse everything. But Helen was prepared. She had followed every protocol, had documented every decision, and knew that her actions were legally sound. Roderick had committed an assault in front of a room full of witnesses and cameras. There was no denying it, no way to distort that truth. Outside, in the cell where Roderick had been taken, he paced back and forth like a caged animal. His mind raced, trying to process what had happened, trying to find a way out. He had called his lawyer, demanding to be released immediately. But Dr. Paul Carter had been objective in saying it would take time. Roderick had committed a grave act and the consequences would be severe. For the first time in his life, Roderick Thompson found himself truly powerless. His money, his connections, his power, none of it mattered now. He was behind bars, and the image of him assaulting Marina was being broadcast to millions of people. His reputation, carefully built over decades, was shattering in a matter of hours. And while he remained there, alone in that cell, Marina was surrounded by support. Clara was already planning the next legal steps, preparing to secure not only the divorce, but also a restraining order and protective measures. Helen, despite her position as a judge, was determined to ensure her daughter's safety using all available legal resources. The news of the assault spread like wildfire. Women's rights advocacy groups began to demonstrate, calling for justice for Marina. Employees of Thompson Developments began to be interviewed, and some of them revealed stories of Roderick's abusive behavior in the workplace as well. The empire he had built was beginning to crack, and the fissures were growing wider. In the hours following the assault, all of London seemed to be discussing the case. Major newspapers already featured the story in their online headlines, and news programs interrupted their regular programming to discuss the incident. Family law experts were invited to comment on the legal implications, while psychologists spoke about patterns of abusive behavior and warning signs that often go unnoticed. Marina had been taken to her mother's house, a discreet residence in a quiet neighborhood in Hampstead. It was a house she knew well, where she had grown up, and where she had always felt safe. Helen had insisted that Marina stay there until everything calmed down, and Marina, physically and emotionally exhausted, had no strength to disagree. She lay in the guest room with ice packs on her face, trying to process everything that had happened. Clara had stayed with them for a few hours, discussing legal strategies and preparing the necessary documents to request urgent protective measures. She explained that, with the assault having occurred in court and being filmed, there would be no difficulty in obtaining a restraining order against Roderick. Furthermore, the Crown Prosecution Service would certainly open a criminal case against him. Regardless of the divorce proceedings, Helen served coffee to Clara as they talked in the living room. Her expression was serious, but there was a determination in her eyes that did not go unnoticed. As a judge, she knew exactly what steps to take, what resources to activate. But as a mother, she was fighting against the urge to simply protect Marina from everything and everyone, to make her forget that Roderick Thompson even existed. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Roderick had finally been released after posting bail. His lawyer had managed to convince a judge to set an amount, albeit high, that would allow for his temporary release. Roderick left the police station, surrounded by a team of private security guards, trying to avoid the journalists who clustered outside. But it was impossible to escape completely. Cameras clicked incessantly, and the questions shouted by reporters echoed around him. He answered no questions, keeping his head down as he was quickly escorted to an armored car. But his expression, captured by the camera lenses, was one of barely contained fury. There was no visible remorse, no shame, only rage. In the car, Roderick finally exploded. He yelled at Dr. Paul Carter, blaming him for not having prevented things from reaching that point. He claimed it was absurd that he was being persecuted, that Marina and Helen had orchestrated everything to destroy him. The lawyer tried to calm him, explaining that such a discourse would only worsen his situation, but Roderick wouldn't listen. Roderick's first action, as soon as he arrived at his apartment in one of the most luxurious buildings on Knightsbridge, was to call a press conference. Dr. Paul Carter tried to dissuade him, arguing that it would be better to remain silent until they had a solid defense strategy. But Roderick was convinced he needed to control the narrative. He believed that, if he spoke directly to the media, he could turn public opinion in his favor. The press conference was scheduled for the following afternoon at the headquarters of Thompson Developments. The company's press office worked frantically to organize everything. Although some employees were already questioning whether remaining associated with Roderick was the best decision for their own careers. That night, Marina barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the scene repeating, felt Roderick's hand striking her face, heard the screams. She got up several times, walked to the window, and looked at the silent street below. Eva still couldn't believe she had the courage to go that far, to expose Roderick publicly, to confront him. For so long she had been conditioned to remain silent, to accept, to pretend everything was fine. Helen entered the room around 3 in the morning, finding Marina awake, sitting in the armchair by the window. She said nothing, just sat beside her daughter and held her hand. They remained like that for long minutes, in silence, only each other's presence offering comfort. It was Helen who finally broke the silence. She began to speak about when Marina was a child, about how she had always been a strong and determined girl, about how she faced challenges with impressive courage. She said that same strength was still there. It had merely been temporarily obscured by years of manipulation and abuse, but that now it was resurfacing, stronger than ever. Marina listened in silence, tears streaming down her face. She admitted she was afraid, that she didn't know if she could endure everything that was to come. Helen replied that fear was natural, but that she wouldn't be alone, that she had the support not only of her, but of Clara, of the advocacy groups that had already reached out offering help, and of thousands of people who, even without knowing her personally, were rooting for her. The following morning, Roderick's press conference was broadcast live on major news channels. He was impeccable again, as if the previous day's events had not affected his appearance at all. Seated behind a table with the Thompson Developments logo in the background, he began to read a prepared statement. He spoke about pressure, about moments of extreme stress, about how the past few months had been difficult, both professionally and personally. He admitted he had lost control in court, but tried to contextualize the incident as an isolated moment of weakness, a result of provocations and unjust accusations. He insinuated that Marina had distorted facts, that there was a conspiracy to tarnish his reputation and take control of his company. But his words rang hollow. The images of the assault were clear, undeniable. There was no context that could justify it, and the more he spoke, trying to defend himself, the more evident became his lack of real accountability. He did not genuinely apologize to Marina, nor did he show true remorse. He merely tried to minimize and justify. The public reaction was immediate and devastating for Roderick. On social media, hashtags calling for justice for Marina became the most trending in the country. Partner companies of Thompson Developments began to review their contracts, questioning whether they wanted to remain associated with someone with such an image. Investors started to withdraw, concerned about the impact the scandal could have on their returns. The board of directors of Thompson Developments called an emergency meeting. There were members who argued that Roderick should temporarily step down from the presidency, at least until the situation was resolved. Others argued that replacing him would be an admission of guilt and could further destabilize the company. Discussions were heated, and it was clear there was a deep division. Meanwhile, Clara had secured the restraining order against Roderick. He was legally prohibited from approaching Marina, contacting her by any means and frequenting certain locations where she might be. Violation of any of these conditions would result in immediate arrest. Marina received the news with a mixture of relief and apprehension. The relief came from knowing there was legal protection, that Roderick couldn't simply appear before her. But the apprehension came from knowing him, from knowing that he wasn't someone who easily accepted boundaries, especially when he felt his power was being challenged. At Thompson Developments, more stories began to emerge. Employees, emboldened by Marina's courage, began to recount their own experiences with Roderick. There were reports of shouting, public humiliations, arbitrary dismissals. A former secretary revealed she had been verbally harassed for months before finally resigning. A project manager told how Roderick had appropriated his ideas and ridiculed him when he tried to claim credit. These revelations painted a much broader picture than just a man who had lost control. In a moment of stress, they showed a pattern of abusive behavior, of someone who used power and intimidation to control those around him. Helen, as the judge of the case, needed to maintain professional impartiality, but she also knew she needed to formally recuse herself from the divorce proceedings now that the family relationship had been publicly revealed. She referred the case to a trusted colleague, a judge with an equally solid reputation, ensuring that the process would continue, but without any question of bias. Marina thanked her mother for the decision, understanding that it was the right thing to do. And although Helen could no longer officially preside over the case, she would continue to be Marina's greatest ally, offering advice, support, and protection in all non-legal aspects. The new judge assigned to the case, Dr. Frederick Campbell, was known for his experience in complex family law cases and for his meticulous approach to proceedings. He carefully analyzed all the documents that had already been presented, including the recordings of the hearing where the assault occurred. His first action was to convene a new hearing, where both parties would have the opportunity to present their arguments fully and without interruption. Clara Miller began preparing Marina for this new phase. They met daily at Helen's house, reviewing documents, rehearsing possible questions that might be asked, strengthening Marina's narrative. Clara brought in specialists to assist, including a psychologist specializing in abusive relationship trauma and a financial consultant who would help track all suspicious movements Roderick had made with the couple's money. It was during one of these preparatory sessions that the financial consultant Anne-Marie Roberts made a disturbing discovery. She had gained access to complete bank records with judicial authorization and found not only the transfers that were already known, but also a series of much more elaborate transactions. Roderick had created shell companies, accounts in tax havens, and had moved astronomical sums out of the country. But what most caught Anne-Marie's attention was the discovery that a significant portion of this money had been diverted from client investments of Thompson Developments. Roderick was not just hiding money from Marina, he was potentially involved in financial fraud, affecting dozens of investors who had entrusted their savings to his company. Clara knew this information completely changed the nature of the case. It was no longer just a contentious divorce with domestic violence issues. There was now evidence of potential fraudulent activities that needed to be reported to the competent authorities. She immediately contacted the Crown Prosecution Service, presenting the initial findings and requesting that a formal investigation be opened. When Marina learned of the discoveries, she was shocked. She had always known Roderick was controlling and manipulative in their personal relationship, but she never imagined he could be deceiving his own clients, people who trusted him to manage their investments. She felt a mixture of disgust and sadness upon realizing that the man she married was even worse than she had imagined. The news of the financial investigations quickly leaked to the press. Newspapers were now talking not only about domestic violence, but also about possible large-scale fraud. Thompson Developments shareholders panicked. Extraordinary meetings were called, and the pressure for Roderick to resign as company president increased exponentially. Roderick, isolated in his luxurious apartment, watched his world crumble around him. The phone calls he received grew increasingly aggressive. Investors demanded explanations, business partners wanted to break contracts, board members strongly suggested he step aside. He tried to resist, arguing that it was all a conspiracy, that he was being unfairly persecuted. But his words no longer convinced anyone. Dr. Paul Carter was in an extremely difficult position. As a lawyer, he had a duty to defend his client, but the emerging evidence made that task almost impossible. Moreover, his own reputation was being tarnished by association. He began to seriously consider whether he should continue representing Roderick. It was on a Thursday afternoon, exactly 1 week after the assault in court, that Dr. Paul Carter finally had a frank conversation with Roderick. He presented all the evidence that had been collected, explained the gravity of the fraud accusations, and made it clear that Roderick's situation was far more serious than he seemed willing to admit. He suggested that Roderick consider striking a deal, admitting the financial transgressions in exchange for a reduced sentence, and accepting the divorce terms without contestation. Roderick categorically refused. He shouted that he would admit nothing, that he would not give Marina the satisfaction of defeating him, that he preferred to fight to the last penny, to the last legal recourse available. Dr. Paul Carter left that meeting knowing he needed to make a decision about his own professional future. Meanwhile, Marina was discovering a new facet of herself. Initially, she had filed for divorce merely wanting to distance herself from Roderick, to protect herself and the baby she was expecting. But now, knowing the extent of his actions, knowing there were other victims, she felt a greater responsibility. She was not just fighting for herself, but for all the people Roderick had deceived and harmed. With the support of Clara and Helen, Marina began giving interviews to the press. She spoke not only about her personal experience, but about the importance of holding people in positions of power accountable when they abuse that trust. Her courage inspired other women in similar situations to seek help, to report, to not remain silent. A women's rights advocacy group contacted Marina, offering support and inviting her to become a spokesperson for a national campaign against domestic violence. Marina initially hesitated, feeling inadequate for such a role, but Helen encouraged her. She said that Marina's story could make a difference in the lives of countless women, and that using her platform for good would be a powerful way to transform something terrible into something positive. The new hearing with Dr. Frederick Campbell was scheduled for 2 weeks later. Clara was preparing a solid case, with dozens of witnesses ready to testify, including former employees of Thompson Developments, Roderick and Marina's household staff, and financial experts who could explain the complexities of the discovered frauds. Roderick, for his part, was trying to mount his own defense. He hired an additional team of lawyers, specialists in corporate and criminal law. They worked day and night trying to find legal loopholes, questioning the validity of the evidence, preparing counter-arguments. But even they knew it was becoming increasingly difficult to defend Roderick. The pressure on Roderick reached a new level when the board of Arbus, directors of Thompson Developments, finally voted for his removal as CEO. The decision was made in a tense meeting where the company's lawyers argued that keeping Roderick in leadership represented an unacceptable risk to the continuity of the business. He was informed of the decision via a formal letter delivered by a messenger to his apartment. Roderick was in a state of shock. The company was his creation, his legacy. He had built it from scratch, invested decades of work, and now he was being expelled, removed from what he considered his greatest achievement. For the first time since everything began, he felt the true weight of his actions. Not genuine remorse for what he had done to Marina or the investors, but a painful understanding that there were consequences for his deeds. That night, alone in his empty apartment, Roderick broke. He threw objects against the walls, screamed until he was hoarse, cried tears of rage and frustration. But there was no one there to hear him, no one to comfort him. He had driven everyone around him away with his behavior, and now he was truly alone. Marina, on the other hand, was surrounded by support. In addition, To Helen and Clara, she had reconnected with old friends she had lost touch with during her marriage to Roderick. He had always discouraged these friendships, claiming those people weren't good influences, that they didn't understand the life they led. But now, free from his control, Marina realized that these were precisely the people who offered the genuine support she needed. One of these friends, Julia Foster, had been Marina's college classmate. They were inseparable before Marina met Roderick, but had gradually drifted apart. When Julia learned of what was happening, she immediately reached out, offering all possible support. She visited Marina regularly, bringing food, telling funny stories to distract her, simply being present. It was Julia who suggested that Marina start thinking about her future beyond the divorce. She asked about the dreams Marina had before getting married, about the professional ambitions she had set aside. Marina remained silent for a long moment, realizing it had been a long time since she had thought of herself as anything more than Roderick Thompson's wife. Marina had studied architecture, graduating with honors. She loved to design, to create spaces that told stories, that made people feel welcomed. But soon after graduation, she met Roderick at a business party. He had been captivated by her, and their courtship was intense from the start. When they married, Roderick suggested she didn't need to work, that he earned enough for both of them, that she should focus on taking care of the house and eventually the children they would have. At the time, Marina interpreted that as care, as a gesture of love, but over time she realized it was control. Roderick didn't want her to have her own career, financial independence and identity separate from his. He wanted her to depend completely on him, for her life to revolve exclusively around his needs. Now talking with Julia, Marina began to imagine what it would be like to resume her career. Perhaps start small, perhaps do some freelance projects, redesign her own life in the same way she designed spaces. The idea was daunting, but also exciting. For the first time in years, she was beginning to envision a future that was truly her own. The Crown Prosecution Service's investigation into Roderick's frauds progressed rapidly. A team of auditors was examining every transaction of Thompson Developments over the past 5 years. They discovered an elaborate scheme where Roderick diverted funds from construction projects, overcharged for materials and services, and pocketed the difference through his shell companies. Some of the defrauded investors began to organize to file class action lawsuits against Roderick and the company. They wanted to recover their money and were willing to fight legally for it. Thompson Developments, now under new interim management, was fully cooperating with the investigations, trying to distance itself from Roderick and salvage what remained of the company's reputation. Dr. Paul Carter finally made the decision to withdraw from the case. He sent a formal letter to Roderick, explaining that he could no longer represent him due to ethical conflicts and the nature of the accusations. Roderick was furious, accusing Paul of betrayal, of abandoning him when he needed him most. But Paul was at peace with his decision. His conscience would not allow him to continue defending someone who had clearly committed so many transgressions. Roderick needed to hire a new lawyer, which took time and further complicated his situation. The lawyer who finally accepted the case, Dr. Mark Stone, was known for taking on difficult and controversial causes, but even he admitted it would be an arduous battle. He advised Roderick to seriously consider making settlements, both in the divorce proceedings and the criminal investigations, but Roderick remained inflexible. Meanwhile, Marina was making significant progress in her emotional recovery. Sessions with the psychologist were helping her process years of psychological abuse, recognize patterns of manipulation she had normalized, and rebuild her self-esteem. She began making notes in a diary, recording her feelings, her fears, her hopes. It was a form of additional therapy, a way to organize her thoughts. Helen observed her daughter's transformation with a mixture of pride and relief. She had always known Marina was strong, but had feared that years under Roderick's dominance had broken that spirit. Seeing Marina resurfacing, finding her voice again, was deeply gratifying. The new hearing finally arrived. The room was once again crowded, but this time the atmosphere was different. There was an expectation, a sense that justice would be served. Marina entered with Clara by her side, wearing a discreet suit, her hair pulled back, an expression of calm determination on her face. The bruise on her face had completely disappeared, but photographs taken in the days following the assault were among the evidence to be presented. Roderick arrived with his new lawyer, Dr. Mark Stone. He seemed diminished somehow. The arrogant confidence that had always characterized him had been replaced by something darker. He avoided looking directly at Marina, keeping his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. Judge Frederick Campbell opened the hearing with his clear and authoritative voice. He explained that they would examine not only issues related to the divorce, but also allegations of abuse and the financial implications of recent discoveries. He made it clear that he expected absolute decorum from all parties and that any inappropriate behavior would result in severe consequences. Clara presented first. She brought in the witnesses she had carefully prepared. The first was Mrs. Constance, who had worked as a housekeeper in Roderick and Marina's home for 3 years. In a trembling but firm voice, she described the various occasions when she witnessed Roderick shouting at Marina, humiliating her, controlling every aspect of her domestic life. She recounted one time she found Marina crying in the bathroom after a particularly violent argument, and how Roderick forbade her from comforting her employer. The next witness was Charles Albert, a former project manager at Thompson Developments. He spoke about the toxic work environment created by Roderick, about how he intimidated employees, appropriated others' ideas, and punished anyone who questioned his decisions. Charles also mentioned that he had several times heard Roderick speaking on the phone with Marina in an aggressive and disrespectful manner, even when he was in the office surrounded by other people. But it was the testimony of Anne-Marie Roberts, the financial consultant, that brought the most dramatic moment of the hearing. She presented detailed spreadsheets, graphs, and documents that tracked the flow of money from Roderick and Marina's joint accounts to shell companies, and, from these to offshore accounts, she explained in layman's terms how the scheme worked, making it clear to everyone in the room that Roderick had not only hidden money from Marina, but had systematically stolen from her. Even more shocking was when Anne-Marie revealed that a portion of the diverted money had originally been Marina's inheritance. When Marina's father passed away years ago, he left her a substantial sum. Roderick had convinced Marina to deposit this money into an account he would manage, promising to invest it wisely for their future. But instead, he had transferred almost all of it to his personal accounts, using the money to fund his excessive lifestyle and risky speculations. Marina felt a knot in her throat upon hearing this. She had always wondered what had happened to her father's inheritance. But Roderick always had convincing explanations about investments that didn't work out or unexpected expenses. She never imagined he had simply stolen everything. The reaction in the room was immediate. Murmurs spread among those present, and journalists scribbled furiously. Even Judge Frederick Campbell seemed shocked by the revelation, though he maintained his professional composure. Dr. Mark Stone tried to counter-argue, suggesting that all of this was part of the normal administration of the couple's assets, that Roderick had the right to manage investments as he saw fit. But his arguments sounded hollow in the face of the presented evidence. The judge interrupted him, asking him to be more specific and to present documentation supporting his claims. It was then that something no one expected happened. A man sitting among the spectators abruptly stood up. It was Gabriel Meadows, one of the main investors in Thompson Developments, and someone Roderick considered a personal friend. Gabriel asked the judge for permission to speak, and after a moment of hesitation, the judge allowed it. Gabriel addressed Roderick directly, ignoring court protocols. In a voice charged with emotion and anger, he said he had trusted Roderick not only as a business partner, but as a friend. He had invested his life savings in Thompson Developments projects, believing the promises of return Roderick had made. Now, knowing that money had been diverted, that Roderick had lied to him and dozens of other people, Gabriel felt betrayed in a way that words could not express. Roderick finally looked up, and for the first time there was something that looked like genuine regret in his expression, but it lasted only a moment. Quickly, the mask of arrogance returned, and he looked away again. The judge thanked Gabriel for his testimony, though it was not procedural, and asked him to sit down. He then announced a brief recess so he could review the presented evidence and deliberate on the next steps. During the recess, Marina stepped out into the corridor accompanied by Clara and Helen. She needed air, a moment to process everything that was being revealed. Julia was waiting outside and immediately enveloped Marina in a tight hug. They remained like that for a few minutes, Marina letting the tears finally flow. They weren't tears of sadness exactly, but of liberation. Each revelation, each testimony, was as if a layer of lies was being peeled away, exposing the truth she had tried to ignore for so long. Gabriel Meadows approached the group, his expression still laden with emotion. He apologized to Marina for speaking impulsively, but said he couldn't help himself upon hearing about what Roderick had done. Marina thanked him, saying his testimony had meant a lot, that knowing other people had also been deceived in a way made her feel less alone. Gabriel mentioned that he was organizing a group of defrauded investors, and that they were considering not only suing Roderick, but also pressing authorities to accelerate the criminal investigation. He said he had contacts at the Crown Prosecution Service and would do everything in his power to ensure Roderick answered for all his actions. Inside the private room, where Roderick was with Dr. Mark Stone, the atmosphere was tense. The lawyer was trying to make his client understand the gravity of the situation. He explained that the presented evidence was overwhelming, that there was no convincing defense against such clear documents and testimonies. He suggested once again that Roderick consider striking a deal, admitting guilt in exchange for less severe conditions. But Roderick was in denial. He insisted that it was all a setup, that Marina and Helen had conspired against him from the start, that the testimonies were fabricated. Dr. Mark Stone sighed, realizing he was dealing with someone who simply couldn't accept the reality of his own actions. When the hearing resumed, Judge Frederick Campbell had a serious expression. He began by announcing that based on the evidence presented, he was determining some immediate measures. First, he was freezing all remaining assets in Roderick Thompson's name, preventing him from continuing to move funds or sell properties. Second, he mandated that a full and independent audit be conducted on all companies associated with Roderick to identify the total scope of the financial irregularities. Third, and most important for Marina, he granted an immediate divorce based on irreparable breakdown of the marital bond, exacerbated by proven domestic violence. He also ordered Roderick to fully restore Marina's diverted inheritance, with monetary correction and interest. Furthermore, he established substantial alimony for Marina and for the child on the way, until the complete division of assets was finalized. Marina felt a wave of relief so intense it almost knocked her over. Clara squeezed her hand, smiling broadly. It was more than they had hoped for, a significant victory. Roderick, on the other hand, was pale, his hands trembling slightly. He looked at his lawyer as if expecting him to do something, anything, to reverse it. Dr. Mark Stone stood up, trying to argue that some of the determinations were excessive, that Roderick had the right to manage his own assets as long as there wasn't a definitive criminal conviction. But the judge was firm, explaining that there was more than enough evidence of a risk of asset dissipation and that the measures were necessary to protect the interests not only of Marina, but of all creditors and defrauded investors. The judge then announced that he was forwarding copies of all documents and testimonies to the Crown Prosecution Service, recommending the formal opening of criminal proceedings against Roderick Thompson for fraud, embezzlement, and other financial offenses. He also ordered Roderick to remain in the city, with his passport confiscated, until the investigations were concluded. When the hearing ended, Marina was surrounded by journalists in the corridor, but this time, instead of hiding, she decided to speak. In a calm but firm voice, she thanked the judicial system for listening to her, for taking her accusations seriously, for protecting her. She said that her struggle was not just personal, but represented all women who suffer in silence, all people who are abused by those who should love them. She also spoke directly to the victims of Roderick's frauds, saying that she understood the pain of betrayal, the feeling of having trusted someone who didn't deserve that trust. She promised that she would do everything in her power to support efforts to recover the diverted funds. Marina's words were broadcast nationally, and the reaction was overwhelming. Thousands of messages of support flooded social media. Women's rights advocacy groups praised her for her courage, Even people who initially questioned her motives upon seeing her connection with Judge Helen now recognized that her struggle was genuine and important. Roderick, for his part, left the courthouse through the back entrance, avoiding the press. He was taken directly to his apartment, where he remained isolated. The few friends he still had stopped answering his calls. His family, ashamed by the public revelations, kept their distance. He was truly alone. In the days that followed, more details about Roderick's frauds continued to emerge. The audit ordered by the judge revealed that the scheme was even more extensive than initially imagined. He had diverted funds from at least 20 different projects over 5 years, totaling tens of millions of pounds. Some of the projects had been abandoned or poorly executed because the money allocated to them had been stolen. Thompson Developments, under new management, was fighting to survive. The new interim CEO, Robert Harrison, was an experienced executive brought in from outside to try and save the company. He implemented a policy of full transparency, cooperating with all investigations and trying to rebuild customer and investor trust. But it was a difficult battle. The Thompson brand was irrevocably stained by the acts of its founder. Marina, meanwhile, was beginning to seriously think about her future. The alimony established by the judge ensured her immediate financial stability. But she wanted more than that. She wanted to rebuild her own identity, have a career, be independent not out of necessity but by choice. She began making contacts in the architecture market, presenting a portfolio she had neglected for years. To her surprise, several firms showed interest. Some explicitly mentioned that they admired her courage and would love to have someone with her story on their teams. Others simply recognized her talent, which remained intact despite years away from the profession. Helen observed all this with deep satisfaction. Seeing her daughter not just surviving but thriving was the greatest reward she could have. She knew that the path ahead would still have challenges, that Marina would have moments of doubt and fear, but she also knew that her daughter had the strength necessary to overcome them. One afternoon, while having tea on the veranda of Helen's house, Marina finally verbalized something she had been thinking about for weeks. She said she wanted to use her platform, the attention she was receiving, to do something bigger. She wanted to create an organization that would help women in domestic abuse situations rebuild their lives, offering not only emotional and legal support, but also helping them develop professional skills and find employment. Helen thought the idea was wonderful. She offered not only moral support, but also her own connections in the judicial system and in non-profit organizations. Julia, when she learned of the idea, immediately volunteered to help, using her marketing skills to promote the initiative. Clara Miller also got excited about the project. She suggested that the organization could offer free legal consultations for women who lacked the resources to hire private lawyers, helping them navigate the complex legal system to obtain protection and justice. The project quickly began to take shape. Marina decided to name it Rebirth, symbolizing the transformation she herself was experiencing. They began working on a business plan, identifying funding sources, recruiting volunteers, establishing partnerships with other organizations. 3 months after the decisive hearing, London was witnessing a remarkable transformation. Marina had become a symbol of resilience and hope for thousands of women across the country. The Rebirth project was already operational, running from a small office in the Shoreditch neighborhood, with a dedicated team of volunteers and professionals who shared Marina's vision. The organization had served over 50 women in its first 2 months of operation, offering everything from legal counseling to professional training workshops. Marina personally participated in several sessions, sharing her own story and offering hope to those who were still in the midst of their own battles. Marina's pregnancy was advanced, and she began to feel the baby's constant movements, reminding her daily why she had fought so hard. She had transformed one of the rooms in Helen's house into a cozy nursery, painted in soft aqua tones, decorated with furniture she herself had designed. It was her first architectural project in years, and though small, it meant the world to her. Roderick, meanwhile, faced the complete downfall of his empire. The Crown Prosecution Service had formally filed criminal charges against him for multiple accusations of fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering. His assets remained frozen, and he was living on a minimal allowance established by the court, barely enough to cover basic expenses. The luxurious apartment had been put up for sale as part of the process of recovering funds for the defrauded investors. But Roderick's downfall was not just financial. It was also social and psychological. He had lost everything that defined his identity: power, status, respect. People who once bowed before him now avoided him. His family kept their distance, ashamed by the public revelations. He was truly alone, facing the consequences of decades of abusive and unethical behavior. It was on a Tuesday morning that something unexpected happened. Marina received a letter delivered by messenger. It was from Roderick. With trembling hands, she opened it, not knowing what to expect. The letter was long, handwritten on simple paper. Roderick wrote about regret, about how he had spent the last few months reflecting on his actions, about how he was finally beginning to understand the magnitude of what he had done. He did not ask for forgiveness because he recognized he didn't deserve it. He didn't try to justify his actions. He simply acknowledged the truth, that he had been an abuser, a fraudster, someone who deeply hurt those who trusted him. He wrote specifically about Marina, about how she deserved much better, about how he hoped she would find the happiness he was never able to provide. Marina read the letter several times, feeling a confused mixture of emotions. Part of her wanted to believe the regret was genuine, but another part, the part that had learned about patterns of manipulation, questioned whether it was just another attempt to gain sympathy. She decided not to respond. That chapter of her life was closed, and she had no intention of reopening it, no matter how convincing his words were. Instead, Marina focused her energy on preparing the official launch of Rebirth. They had organized a fundraising event and to raise awareness about the organization's mission. They managed to secure a space in an elegant hotel in central London, and several personalities confirmed their attendance, including politicians, celebrities, and business people who wanted to support the cause. On the night of the event, Marina was nervous but determined. She wore an elegant dress that comfortably accommodated her pregnant belly, her hair loose in soft waves. Helen was by her side, proud and protective. Julia had worked tirelessly to ensure every detail was perfect, from the decor to the guest list. The hall was packed when Marina stepped onto the stage to deliver her speech. She looked out at the audience, seeing hundreds of attentive faces, and took a deep breath. She began by telling her story, not sparing details about the abuse she suffered, about how she almost lost herself in the process. She spoke about the moment she decided she could no longer continue living that way, about the courage it took to take the first step. But most importantly, Marina spoke about hope, about how even in the darkest moments, there was light at the end of the tunnel, about how she had discovered strength she didn't know she possessed, about how she now wanted to use her experience to light the way for other women who were where she had been. When she finished, the hall erupted in applause. Many people had tears in their eyes. Several women approached her afterward, sharing their own stories, thanking Marina for giving voice to experiences they too had lived, but had never been able to express. The event raised much more money than Marina had expected. Business leaders made generous donations, some moved by Marina's story, others by the opportunity to publicly dissociate themselves from the kind of behavior Roderick represented. The Rebirth organization now had enough resources to expand its operations, perhaps opening a second office in another part of the city. While the event was happening, Roderick watched the live broadcast in his virtually empty apartment. He saw Marina speak with confidence and eloquence, saw the support she received, saw the positive impact she was creating, and for the first time, he felt something beyond anger or self-pity. He felt genuine shame. Not the shame of being caught, but the shame of having been the kind of person capable of those acts. In the months that followed, Marina's life continued to flourish. She accepted a position at a respected architectural firm, working part-time while preparing for the baby's arrival. Her projects were creative and innovative, and she quickly gained recognition in her field. When the day of birth arrived, Helen was by Marina's side in the delivery room, holding her hand through each contraction. Julia waited anxiously outside, and when the baby finally arrived, a healthy and noisy girl, Marina felt a joy, so pure and complete that it eclipsed all the difficulties she had faced. She named the girl Sophia, which means wisdom. It was a reminder of everything she had learned, of all the strength she had discovered within herself. When she held Sophia for the first time, Marina made a silent promise that she would raise her daughter in an environment of love and respect, that she would teach her from an early age about her own worth, that she would ensure she never accepted being treated the way Marina had been. The criminal proceedings against Roderick took almost another year to conclude. When he finally went to trial, he was convicted of fraud and embezzlement. The sentence included full restitution of all diverted funds and a significant penalty that he would serve under a semi-open regime, allowing him to work during the day but return to custody at night. Part of the sentence also included community service at organizations supporting victims of domestic violence. The judge hoped that being directly confronted with the consequences of behaviors like his own could contribute to genuine transformation. Marina did not attend Roderick's trial. That chapter was closed for her. She was too busy living her new life, caring for Sophia, developing her career, expanding Rebirth. The organization now had 3 offices in London and plans for expansion to other major cities. Helen retired a few months after Sophia's birth, saying she wanted time to enjoy being a grandmother. She spent her days helping Marina with the baby, volunteering at Rebirth, finally having time for the hobbies she had neglected during decades of an intense judicial career. On a sunny Sunday, 2 years after that fateful hearing, Marina was in a park with Sophia. The girl, now a vibrant and curious child, ran among the trees while Marina watched her with a smile. Helen sat beside her on a bench, knitting a small cardigan. Julia had just arrived with coffee for everyone. Marina looked around, soaking in the scene. The sunlight filtered through the leaves, the sound of Sophia's laughter, the comforting presence of her mother and her best friend. She thought about how much her life had changed, how unrecognizable she was compared to the frightened, silenced woman who had entered that courtroom 2 years ago. She had lost a lot in the process, it was true, but she had also gained much more. She gained herself back, she gained her voice, she gained the ability to create an authentic life, based on her own values and desires, not someone else's. And most importantly, she had proven that it was possible to start anew, that no matter how far you have fallen, how broken you may be, there is always the possibility of rebuilding, that the strength needed to change had always been there, just waiting to be discovered. Marina smiled, calling Sophia, who ran back and jumped into her lap. She kissed her daughter's head, breathing in the scent of baby, shampoo, and felt a profound gratitude, not for the suffering she had endured, but for the person she had become because of it. Marina's story was not a tale of victimization, but of transformation, of a woman who refused to be defined by what was done to her, choosing instead to be defined by how she responded. And in that response, she not only saved herself, but illuminated the path for countless others who would follow. Dear listeners, we hope Marina's story and her journey of transformation have deeply touched you. This narrative shows us that there is always hope, even in the most difficult situations, and that one person's courage can inspire thousands. To continue following stories as moving as this one, we have prepared a special playlist with narratives that explore the complexity of life and the strength of the human spirit. You can find it by clicking here on the left. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give the video a like. Every day we bring unique content that celebrates resilience, love, and justice. Share your reflections in the comments below. We'd love to know what this story meant to you. Until the next narrative,